March 2nd, 1476. The Swiss Alps. A freezing wind tears across the mountain pass as 500 men stand in silence. They're not soldiers in any traditional sense. They're farmers, craftsmen, shepherds, men with calloused hands and weathered faces who have spent their lives wrestling with unforgiving terrain. Their weapons are simple: 18-foot pikes, halberds, crossbows, no cavalry, no cannons, no armor worth mentioning, just flesh, steel, and a fury that's been building for generations. Across the valley, stretching as far as the eye can see, the most formidable military force in Western Europe prepares for what it believes will be a routine slaughter. 6,000 Burgundian soldiers, knights in gleaming plate armor, professional men-at-arms who have spent their entire lives training for war. Artillery batteries that can reduce castle walls to rubble. Cavalry that's terrorized every battlefield from the Low Countries to the Rhine. At their head sits Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, a man so consumed by ambition that he dreams of resurrecting the ancient kingdom of Lotharingia and crowning himself its king. Charles looks down at the ragged band of mountaineers blocking his path and sees nothing: peasants playing at war. An obstacle to be swept aside in an afternoon. His advisors have told him the Swiss are dangerous, that they fight with a savagery uncommon in civilized warfare. Charles doesn't care. He has 12 times their numbers. He has the finest army gold can buy. He has destiny on his side. What Charles doesn't understand, what he can't possibly understand, is that he's about to participate in one of the most lopsided military defeats in European history. Within hours, those 500 Swiss will shatter his army, capture his treasury, humiliate him before the crowned heads of Europe, and set in motion a chain of events that will ultimately cost him everything: his crown, his empire, his life. This is the story of how a handful of alpine peasants crushed the most powerful duchy in Europe, and in doing so, forged a nation that would remain unconquered for the next 500 years. If you're new here, this channel tells stories that matter. No filler, no fluff. Just the decisions, the bloodshed, and the consequences. If this video teaches you something new, hit that like button. It costs you nothing and helps more than you know. Now let's go back to the 15th century and find out how Switzerland was really born. To understand why 500 Swiss farmers were willing to die on a frozen mountain pass, you need to understand what they were fighting for. And to understand that, you need to understand Charles the Bold. Charles inherited the Duchy of Burgundy in 1467, and from day one, he made no secret of his intentions. Burgundy was already one of the wealthiest territories in Europe. It controlled the prosperous cloth-producing cities of Flanders. It held strategic lands stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. But Charles wanted more. He wanted a kingdom. The problem was geography. Burgundian territory was split in two. The wealthy northern holdings around the Low Countries were separated from the southern duchy by a patchwork of independent territories. To unite his realm, Charles needed to conquer everything in between. The Rhineland, Alsace, Lorraine, and nestled in the heart of the Alps, blocking his expansion routes to Italy, sat the Swiss Confederacy. The Swiss Confederacy in 1476 was not yet a nation. It was a loose alliance of 8 cantons, mountain communities that had banded together over the previous 2 centuries for mutual defense. Uri, Schwyz, Unterwalden, Lucerne, Zurich, Glarus, Zug, and Bern. These were not wealthy territories. There were no great cities, no merchant princes, no cathedrals dripping with gold. What they had was something more valuable: a warrior culture forged by centuries of resisting outside domination. The Swiss had been fighting for their independence since 1291, when 3 forest cantons swore an oath of mutual defense against the Habsburgs. For nearly 200 years, they'd been proving that oath wasn't empty words. They defeated Austrian knights at Morgarten in 1315, crushing a force that outnumbered them 3-1 by triggering an avalanche of logs and boulders. They'd won again at Sempach in 1386, where the legendary Arnold Winkelried supposedly threw himself onto Austrian lancers to create a gap in the enemy line. They'd fought off invasion after invasion, earning a reputation as the most dangerous infantry in Europe. This reputation wasn't based on individual skill. A Swiss farmer with a pike wasn't necessarily a better fighter than a trained knight. What made the Swiss terrifying was how they fought together. The Swiss pike square was a formation so disciplined, so coordinated, that it functioned like a single organism. Hundreds, sometimes thousands of men moving in perfect unison, their 18-foot pikes creating an impenetrable forest of steel that cavalry couldn't break and infantry couldn't survive. But the real secret of Swiss military power wasn't tactical. It was psychological. The Swiss didn't fight for pay or glory. They fought for each other, for their families, for their freedom. They fought with a desperation that professional soldiers couldn't match because they knew exactly what defeat meant: subjugation, slavery, the destruction of everything they'd spent 2 centuries building, and there was something else. The Swiss had a policy that terrified their enemies. They took no prisoners. They asked for no quarter and gave none. Surrender wasn't an option. When a Swiss army went to war, it was with the understanding that they would either win or die to the last man. This wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was strategy. If your enemies know that fighting you means death regardless of the outcome, they think twice about fighting at all. Charles the Bold knew all of this. His advisors had warned him repeatedly about the Swiss. But Charles was a man who confused boldness with wisdom. He'd already crushed or bought off every obstacle in his path. The King of France feared him. The Holy Roman Emperor negotiated with him as an equal. The Pope sent envoys seeking his favor. What were a few mountain peasants compared to the might of Burgundy? The conflict began over a piece of territory called the Sundgau. In 1469, a minor Austrian duke named Sigismund had pledged this Alsatian territory to Charles as collateral for a loan. The Swiss considered the Sundgau vital to their security. Its loss to Burgundy would put Charles's armies directly on their western border. When Sigismund tried to redeem his pledge in 1474, Charles refused. He had no intention of giving up such strategically valuable land. The Swiss responded exactly as their history suggested they would. They allied with Sigismund, raised an army, and invaded Burgundian territory. In November 1474, they besieged and captured the fortress of Héricourt. In the fighting, they killed or captured over 6,000 Burgundian soldiers. Charles's garrison at Grandson, a stronghold on Lake Neuchâtel, was isolated and exposed. Charles now faced a choice. He could negotiate, cede the disputed territories, and focus on his other ambitions, or he could crush the Swiss so thoroughly that no one would ever question Burgundian power again. Being Charles the Bold, there was never really any doubt which path he would choose. In February 1476, Charles assembled the largest army he'd ever commanded. Contemporary sources vary on exact numbers, but the force that marched towards Switzerland that winter included somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 men. Knights from across Burgundian territory, English longbowmen, the most feared archers in Europe, Italian mercenaries who'd learned their trade in decades of peninsular warfare, German landsknechts hired at enormous expense, and artillery, hundreds of cannons ranging from small field pieces to massive siege guns that could fire stone balls weighing over 100 pounds. This wasn't just an army, it was a statement. Charles was bringing enough force to not merely defeat the Swiss, but to annihilate them. To wipe the Confederacy off the map and make an example that would echo through the centuries. His first target was the castle of Grandson. Grandson was a medieval fortress perched on the western shore of Lake Neuchâtel. It wasn't particularly large or particularly strong by the standards of the day, but it sat astride one of the main routes into the Swiss heartland. The garrison defending it numbered around 700 men, most of them from Bern, the most militarily powerful of the Swiss cantons. Charles arrived before Grandson on February 19th and immediately began siege operations. His artillery pounded the walls day and night. His engineers dug trenches and positioned assault towers. The bombardment was relentless, the kind of concentrated firepower that had reduced greater fortresses to rubble in days. But the defenders of Grandson were Swiss. For 10 days they held. They repaired breaches as fast as Charles's cannons could make them. They launched sorties that killed dozens of Burgundian soldiers. They fought with a ferocity that stunned the besiegers, but they couldn't hold forever. The walls were crumbling. Supplies were running out, and no relief force had appeared. On February 28th, the garrison surrendered. They'd been promised safe conduct. They'd been told that if they laid down their arms, they would be allowed to march out with their lives. The Burgundian commander who accepted their surrender may have meant to keep that promise. Charles the Bold did not. What happened next would echo through Swiss history for centuries. Charles ordered all 700 prisoners executed. Some were hanged from the walls of the castle they defended so bravely. Others were drowned in the lake, their hands tied behind their backs as they were thrown from boats. A few were simply cut down where they stood. The message was clear: defy Burgundy and die. Charles thought he was breaking Swiss morale. He was forging Swiss fury. When news of the massacre reached Bern, the reaction was immediate and absolute. Every military-age man who could carry a weapon was called to arms. Messages raced to every canton in the Confederacy. What had been a border dispute became a war of survival. The Swiss weren't fighting for territory anymore. They were fighting for blood. Within days, a Swiss army began assembling at Neuchâtel. Men streamed in from across the Confederacy, bringing their pikes and halberds and the cold rage of a people who just watched 700 of their countrymen murdered after surrender. By March 1st, perhaps 20,000 Swiss had gathered. Not a professional army by any traditional measure, but a force united by shared fury and centuries of martial tradition. The problem was coordination. The Swiss army was organized by canton, and each canton had its own commanders, its own priorities, its own ideas about how to fight. There was no supreme commander, no unified chain of command. Getting 20,000 independently minded mountaineers to agree on anything was a challenge that would have tested Alexander the Great. On the morning of March 2nd, a vanguard of roughly 500 men from the canton of Schwyz set out to reconnoiter the Burgundian positions. They weren't supposed to engage. They were supposed to scout the enemy, assess his strength, and report back. The main army would follow once the commanders had agreed on a plan of attack. That plan lasted until the vanguard crested a ridge and saw the Burgundian army spread out below them. The Swiss vanguard found itself staring at a force that outnumbered it 12-1. Knights in gleaming armor, ranks of archers with longbows that could punch through plate at 200 yards, artillery batteries already turned toward the mountain passes. And behind them, stretching toward Grandson, the vast baggage train that carried Charles's personal treasury, his collection of jewels and tapestries and golden plate, the accumulated wealth of the richest duchy in Europe. A rational commander would have retreated. A professional soldier would have withdrawn and reported back to the main army. The men of Schwyz did neither. They attacked. Try to understand what this means. 500 men with pikes and halberds charged downhill into an army of 6,000, not because they had a plan. Not because they thought they could win, because they saw the men who'd murdered their countrymen at Grandson and they couldn't stop themselves. Charles the Bold was eating breakfast when scouts brought him news of the Swiss attack. He didn't believe it at first. The report made no tactical sense. Why would a handful of infantry charge a prepared position held by vastly superior forces? It had to be a diversion. The main Swiss army must be planning to strike somewhere else. Charles ordered his forces to form battle lines. Cavalry moved to the flanks. Infantry formed squares around the artillery. Everything by the book, exactly as a professional army should respond to an enemy attack. And then Charles watched something he'd never seen before in 30 years of warfare. The Swiss came down the mountainside in a formation that looked almost organic. Not a rigid line of infantry, but a wedge of men that seemed to flow around obstacles, maintaining cohesion even over broken terrain. Their pikes were lowered, 18 feet of iron-tipped ash pointing at the Burgundian lines like the spines of some massive, lethal creature, and they were singing. The Swiss always sang when they went to war, battle hymns and drinking songs, psalms and ancient chants that had been passed down through generations. The sound was eerie, hundreds of voices rising in harmony as the pikemen advanced. Burgundian soldiers who'd faced every enemy in Europe later said it was the most unsettling thing they'd ever heard. Charles's first response was textbook. He ordered his artillery to fire. 15th-century cannons were devastating against static targets. Castle walls, massed infantry formations, ships at anchor, but they had severe limitations. They were slow to reload, difficult to aim, and useless against moving targets at any significant distance. Charles's gunners had perhaps time for one volley before the Swiss would be upon them. The cannons roared. Smoke and fire erupted across the Burgundian line. Stone and iron balls tore through the air toward the advancing Swiss. They killed almost no one. The Swiss weren't advancing in a dense formation. They'd learned centuries ago that artillery slaughtered close-backed infantry. Instead, they came in loose order, spreading across the mountainside, presenting no concentrated target. The cannonballs that should have torn bloody furrows through their ranks instead bounced harmlessly between scattered groups of pikemen. Charles's next response was cavalry. This was supposed to be the decisive arm of medieval warfare. Armored knights on heavy warhorses charging at full gallop into enemy infantry. The impact alone should scatter foot soldiers like chaff. Every military manual of the era agreed. Cavalry broke infantry. That was simply how war worked. The Burgundian knights spurred their horses and charged. What happened next changed European military history. The Swiss didn't break. They didn't scatter. They didn't even slow down. As the cavalry thundered toward them, the front ranks of pikemen dropped to one knee and braced their weapons against the ground. The second and third ranks leveled their pikes over the shoulders of the men in front. In seconds, the advancing Swiss wedge had transformed into a bristling wall of steel points, each pike extending far beyond the reach of any cavalry sword or lance. The horses saw the pikes and tried to stop. Warhorses are brave, but they're not suicidal. Faced with a solid wall of sharp points, even the best trained destrier will refuse the charge. Knights who'd spent their lives in the saddle suddenly found themselves fighting their own mounts, trying to force terrified animals into certain death. A few horses made it through. Their riders died in seconds, pulled from their saddles by halberds and hacked apart before they hit the ground. The rest of the cavalry charge dissolved into chaos, knights wheeling away, horses rearing, the disciplined formation collapsing into a panicked mob. And through it all, the Swiss kept coming. They hit the Burgundian infantry like a battering ram. The pike square was designed for exactly this moment. The front ranks engaged, their long weapons keeping enemies at distance while they stabbed and thrust. The rear ranks pushed forward, adding their weight to the charge, maintaining the momentum that was the formation's greatest strength. Men in the middle ranks couldn't even fight. Their job was simply to push, to keep the formation moving, to prevent the front ranks from being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. For the Burgundian infantry, it was a nightmare. They couldn't reach the Swiss through the forest of pikes. They couldn't hold their ground against the relentless pressure. They couldn't even retreat in good order because the men behind them were blocking any escape. What had been a disciplined military formation began to compress, soldiers stumbling over each other, tripping over the bodies of the fallen, losing all unit cohesion. And that's when the panic started. No one knows exactly what triggered it. Maybe a group of soldiers in the rear saw the cavalry retreat and assumed the battle was lost. Maybe the sound of the Swiss hymns, growing louder as the pikemen advanced, broke something in Burgundian morale. Maybe it was simply the accumulated horror of watching a tiny force tear through their lines with unstoppable fury. Whatever the cause, the Burgundian army broke. Not a tactical withdrawal, not an organized retreat, a complete and total rout. Thousands of men threw down their weapons and ran. Knights abandoned their horses and fled on foot. Soldiers trampled each other trying to escape the Swiss pikes. The most powerful army in Western Europe dissolved in minutes. Charles the Bold watched in disbelief. He'd commanded armies for over a decade. He'd never seen anything like this. His knights, his professionals, his elite forces, running like peasants from a handful of mountain farmers. He screamed orders that no one heard. He tried to rally fleeing soldiers who didn't even look back. His bodyguards finally dragged him away when it became clear the Swiss weren't stopping. The pursuit was merciless. Swiss soldiers chased the fleeing Burgundians for miles, cutting down everyone they caught. The policy of no quarter wasn't forgotten just because they were winning. Men who tried to surrender were killed where they stood. Men who hid were found and executed. The massacre at Grandson was being repaid with interest. When it was over, the Swiss controlled the battlefield and everything on it. The Burgundian dead numbered somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000. The Swiss had lost perhaps 200 men, most of them in the initial charge. But the numbers didn't capture the scale of the disaster that had befallen Charles the Bold. The Swiss had captured his entire artillery train. Over 400 cannons, more firepower than most kingdoms possessed, now belonged to the Confederacy. They'd captured his baggage, including thousands of tents, tons of supplies, and enough weapons and armor to equip an army. They'd captured his war chest, hundreds of thousands of florins in gold and silver that Charles had brought to pay his soldiers, and they'd captured his personal treasury. Charles the Bold was a man who believed in the power of display. He traveled with tapestries woven with gold thread, each one worth more than a prosperous village. He brought furniture inlaid with ivory and precious stones. He carried jewelry that had taken generations to accumulate, diamonds and rubies and pearls that represented centuries of Burgundian wealth. All of it was now in Swiss hands. The most famous piece of plunder was a diamond, not just any diamond. The Florentine diamond, one of the largest and most perfect stones in existence. Swiss soldiers, having never seen such wealth, initially thought it was glass and threw it away. A chaplain found it later and sold it for a few florins, not realizing he was holding a gem worth a king's ransom. It would eventually find its way to the Medici collection and then to the Austrian Habsburgs, a wandering trophy of Swiss victory. Similar stories multiplied across the battlefield. Peasant soldiers who'd never owned more than a few cattle suddenly found themselves holding gold cups and jeweled swords. Men who couldn't read picked up illuminated manuscripts worth fortunes. The wealth of Burgundy was scattered across the Swiss countryside, much of it lost or sold for fractions of its value by victors who didn't understand what they'd captured. But the Swiss understood one thing perfectly. They had won, and Charles the Bold had learned nothing. Here's what you need to understand about Charles. His nickname wasn't an accident. He wasn't called the Bold because he was brave, though he was. He was called the Bold because he was incapable of caution. Every setback only hardened his determination. Every defeat only convinced him that victory was closer. Most commanders, after losing an army and a treasury, would have reconsidered their strategy. Charles assembled a new army and came back for more. The Second Battle of Grandson never happened. Charles learned at least that much. He wouldn't challenge the Swiss in their mountains. Instead, he laid siege to another fortress, the town of Morgarten, hoping to draw the Swiss into attacking him in a prepared position. On June 22, 1476, the Swiss obliged, 25,000 of them. The battle lasted less than 3 hours. The Burgundian army was annihilated. Between 8,000 and 12,000 Burgundians died, many of them drowned in the lake when the Swiss pushed the survivors into the water. Charles escaped with barely his life. Still, he wouldn't quit. He raised another army, this one even more desperate than the last. He marched against the city of Nancy in Lorraine, another enemy who'd allied with the Swiss. On January 5, 1477, outside the walls of that city, the Swiss and their allies caught Charles's army in the open. This time, Charles the Bold didn't escape. His body was found 2 days after the battle, face down in a frozen pond. He'd been struck so many times that he was initially unidentifiable. A lance had pierced his skull. wolves or scavengers had torn at his remains. The Duke of Burgundy, who had dreamed of a crown, was recognized only by his personal physician, who identified the body by old battle scars and missing teeth. With Charles dead and no male heir, the Duchy of Burgundy collapsed. His daughter Mary married the Habsburg Archduke Maximilian, eventually bringing the Burgundian Netherlands into the Habsburg orbit. But the southern Burgundian lands, including the duchy itself, reverted to the French crown. The great Burgundian state that had threatened to dominate Western Europe simply ceased to exist. The Swiss had done more than win a battle. They had destroyed an empire. Now, let's go back to that ridge on March 2nd, 1476, and understand exactly how 500 men accomplished the impossible. Military historians have analyzed the Battle of Grandson for centuries, trying to extract lessons that could be applied to other conflicts. What they've found is simultaneously simple and profound. The Swiss won because they broke every rule of medieval warfare, and they broke those rules because they had to. Consider the conventional wisdom of the 15th century. Infantry was supposed to be a supporting arm, useful for holding ground, but incapable of offensive action against cavalry or well-prepared positions. Knights were the decisive force. Cannons were revolutionary, but required time and position to be effective. Numerical superiority was paramount. An army with a 12-to-1 advantage shouldn't just win, it should win overwhelmingly. The Swiss inverted every assumption. First, speed. The Burgundians expected the Swiss to approach cautiously, to form up at a distance, to give the artillery time to find range. Instead, the Swiss attacked immediately, covering ground so quickly that the cannons never got a second shot. Speed nullified Charles's technological advantage. Second, aggression. Medieval commanders were taught that attacking a larger force was suicide. Better to find defensive terrain, force the enemy to come to you, make them pay for every yard. The Swiss did the opposite. They attacked downhill into a prepared position, throwing themselves at an enemy that should have slaughtered them. This aggression created psychological chaos. The Burgundians weren't prepared for an enemy that seemed actively eager to die. Third, cohesion. The pike square required absolute trust between soldiers. Every man depended on the men beside him, behind him, in front of him. If one soldier broke ranks, the formation collapsed. If everyone held, the formation was nearly invincible. The Swiss had this trust because they weren't strangers thrown together by mercenary contracts. They were neighbors, cousins, men who'd grown up together, trained together, who knew each other's families and farms. They couldn't break because breaking would mean betraying everyone they'd ever known. Fourth, fury. This is the factor that military historians struggle to quantify but can't ignore. The Swiss at Grandson weren't fighting for pay or glory. They were fighting for revenge. Every man in that vanguard knew someone who'd died at the massacre. They charged into a vastly superior force because rage had burned away their capacity for fear. You can't train soldiers to feel that. You can't manufacture that kind of motivation. It has to be real. The combination was devastating. Speed prevented the Burgundians from using their advantages. Aggression created confusion and fear. Cohesion made the Swiss unstoppable once they made contact, and fury drove them forward when any rational force would have retreated. Charles the Bold, for all his experience, had never faced an enemy like this. His entire military career had been spent fighting professional armies, men who understood the calculus of war, who knew when to fight and when to surrender. The Swiss didn't think like that. They came down that mountainside fully expecting to die, fully prepared to take as many Burgundians with them as possible. Against that kind of commitment, superior numbers meant nothing. There's another factor that historians sometimes overlook. The Swiss knew the terrain. They'd spent their lives in these mountains. They knew every path, every ridge, every spot where the footing was treacherous or the ground gave advantage. The Burgundians were fighting in unfamiliar territory, their heavy cavalry struggling on slopes that alpine infantry traversed easily. Geography was a Swiss ally. This geographical advantage extended beyond the immediate battlefield. The Burgundians had supply lines stretching back through hostile territory. The Swiss could fight, retreat into the mountains, and return to fight again. Charles could win every battle and still lose the war. The Swiss could lose every battle except the last one and still survive. This asymmetry shaped the entire conflict. But on March 2nd, 1476, none of that mattered as much as 500 men who decided they'd rather die attacking than live knowing they hadn't tried. The aftermath of Grandson sent shockwaves across Europe. The defeat of the most powerful duchy in the West by a handful of mountain peasants challenged fundamental assumptions about power and warfare. Every monarch, every military commander, every strategic thinker had to reconsider what they thought they knew. If knights could be broken by infantry, if cannon could be nullified by speed, if numerical superiority could be overcome by cohesion and fury, then the rules of war were changing, and everyone needed to figure out how to adapt. The immediate beneficiaries were the Swiss themselves. Their reputation, already formidable, became legendary. Within a generation, Swiss mercenaries would become the most sought-after soldiers in Europe. Kings and popes would pay enormous sums to hire Swiss pikemen, knowing that these men brought something money couldn't buy: a tradition of victory. The French were among the first to recognize the opportunity. Louis XI, the cunning Spider King who'd been secretly funding Swiss resistance to Burgundy, moved quickly to secure an alliance. The Franco-Swiss relationship would endure for centuries, Swiss regiments forming the backbone of French royal guards right up to the Revolution. The Habsburgs learned different lessons. Their long struggle with the Swiss, stretching back to their defeats at Morgarten and Sempach, had taught them that some territories simply weren't worth the cost of conquest. After Grandson, the Habsburgs largely abandoned their ambitions in Switzerland, focusing instead on the easier pickings of the Burgundian inheritance that came through Maximilian's marriage. But the deepest impact was on Switzerland itself. Before Grandson, the Swiss Confederacy was a loose alliance of 8 cantons, united by treaties and tradition, but lacking any real central authority. After Grandson, something changed. The shared experience of victory, the shared glory and shared plunder, created a national consciousness that hadn't existed before. Men who'd fought at Grandson went home as heroes. Their stories became legend. Their songs became anthems. The victory also changed Swiss politics. The more aggressive cantons, particularly Bern and Lucerne, gained prestige from their leading role in the campaign. New cantons sought to join the Confederacy, drawn by the security that alliance with the unconquerable Swiss provided. Freiburg and Solothurn were admitted in 1481. Basel and Schaffhausen followed. The Confederacy that had been 8 cantons grew toward the 13 that would form the core of modern Switzerland. Perhaps most importantly, Grandson proved that Swiss independence was sustainable. For 2 centuries, the Confederacy had survived through luck and geography as much as through martial prowess. Grandson demonstrated that Swiss military power could defeat any enemy, even the richest and most sophisticated. This wasn't just a battle. It was proof of concept. The Swiss would fight many more battles over the following centuries. They would win some and lose some. They would eventually learn that pike squares, however effective, couldn't survive against modern artillery and firearms. The old tactics that had worked so brilliantly at Grandson would become obsolete, but by then it wouldn't matter. The Swiss had established something more valuable than military supremacy. They'd established a reputation. They'd proven that their mountains were a trap for invaders, that their men would fight to the death rather than submit, that conquering Switzerland would cost more than it could ever be worth. That reputation, forged in blood on a frozen mountainside in 1476, would protect Swiss independence long after the pike squares were gone. Napoleon would eventually conquer Switzerland, but even he wouldn't keep it. The Congress of Vienna would restore Swiss sovereignty and neutrality, which would endure through 2 world wars and into the present day. Walk through any Swiss city today and you'll find monuments to the Burgundian Wars. The chapel at Grandson contains ossuaries holding the bones of the fallen. The federal arsenal in Bern displays captured Burgundian weapons. The Swiss Guard at the Vatican, founded in 1506, wears uniforms designed to recall the colors and style of 15th-century Swiss mercenaries. The past isn't past. It's woven into the fabric of Swiss identity. And at the heart of that identity is a simple truth. When 500 men charged down a mountainside into an army that should have annihilated them, they weren't just fighting for their lives. They were fighting for the idea that free men, standing together, could defeat any tyrant. History has few moments as clean as Grandson. Usually, the past is messy. Heroes turn out to have feet of clay. Victories are followed by defeats. Noble causes become tainted by time, but Grandson remains what it was. A small group of ordinary people facing impossible odds, choosing courage over survival and winning, not because they were stronger, not because they were better equipped, not because they had superior numbers or tactical genius. They won because they refused to accept that they should lose. Charles the Bold had everything: wealth, power, the finest army in Europe, the momentum of a decade of conquest. What he didn't have was an understanding that some things can't be bought or conquered. Some peoples won't be subdued. Some mountains aren't worth dying on, no matter how strategic they look on a map. The Swiss understood something Charles never did. They weren't fighting for land or gold or glory. They were fighting for the right to be left alone, to govern themselves, to live as they chose in their mountain valleys. And that kind of motivation, married to skill and discipline and absolute commitment, could overcome any material disadvantage. This is why Grandson matters, not because it changed borders, though it did. Not because it shifted the balance of power, though it did that too. Grandson matters because it demonstrates what human beings are capable of when they're fighting for something they believe in, when they're not mercenaries following orders, but citizens defending their homes. Charles the Bold died less than a year after Grandson, his dreams of empire shattered, his treasury looted, his reputation destroyed. His body lay unrecognized in a frozen ditch, picked at by scavengers, while the men who'd killed him celebrated in the mountains he'd tried to conquer. The Swiss, meanwhile, kept doing what they'd always done. They farmed their valleys and grazed their cattle and trained their sons in the art of the pike. They didn't become an empire. They didn't conquer their neighbors. They didn't try to impose their will on the rest of Europe. They just wanted to be free. 5 centuries later, they still are. There's one more thing worth noting about the Battle of Grandson. The Swiss didn't have to fight. They could have negotiated. Charles might have accepted tribute. Diplomacy might have avoided the bloodshed. But the massacre at the castle made negotiation impossible. Charles had demonstrated what surrender meant. The Swiss responded accordingly. This is a pattern that repeats throughout military history. Atrocities intended to terrify often have the opposite effect. They eliminate the option of surrender. They make clear that there's no safety in capitulation. They transform limited conflicts into wars of annihilation. Charles thought killing those 700 prisoners would break Swiss morale. Instead, it unified the Confederacy as nothing else could have. The Swiss who charged down that mountainside weren't being irrational. They were being perfectly rational, given the information they had. Charles had shown them what he did to prisoners. He'd shown them what defeat would mean. Given those stakes, attacking against impossible odds made sense. Death in battle was preferable to death by execution. This is the calculus that created Switzerland. Not treaties or diplomacy or economic interest, but the simple understanding that these mountains would be defended by men who would rather die than submit. That understanding made Switzerland unconquerable then, and it kept Switzerland independent for 500 years after. The modern Swiss military still trains with this history in mind. Every Swiss citizen serves or has served. The mountains are still honeycombed with defensive positions. The national strategy still assumes that any invader will face the same resistance that Charles the Bold faced. Not because Switzerland has the largest army or the most advanced weapons, but because the Swiss remember what their ancestors did at Grandson. Memory is a weapon. History is armor. When a nation knows what it's capable of, knows it because the proof is written in the chronicles and carved on the monuments, that knowledge shapes everything. The Swiss know they can win against impossible odds because they've done it before. That's what 500 men charging down a mountainside really means. Not just a battle won, or a treasury captured, or a duke humiliated. It means that for 5 centuries and counting, the Swiss have known exactly who they are and what they're willing to do to stay that way. Charles the Bold wanted to build a kingdom. He built a nation instead, just not his own. If this story moved you, if you learned something you didn't know before, do me a favor. Hit the like button. Drop a comment telling me what part resonated with you. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. The algorithm decides who sees this content based on engagement. Your click, your comment, your subscription, they actually matter. I'm building something here, a channel that tells history the way it deserves to be told. No dumbing down, no filler, no pretending that the past was simpler or cleaner than it really was. Just the truth, as close as we can get to it, told with the respect it deserves. Next time we're going somewhere new, another story, another battle that changed history. More lessons written in blood that we're still learning today. Thanks for watching, thanks for listening, and remember, the reason we study history isn't to memorize dates, it's to understand what people are capable of. The Swiss showed us that at Grandson, 500 men against 6,000. Farmers against knights, pikes against cannons, freedom against tyranny, they won.